The first time I realized someone was stealing from me, it wasn't because I noticed money missing, or lights flickering, or even the faint smell of burning wires. It was because I walked into my backyard shed one morning and found a shiny white Tesla snout buried halfway inside it, tethered to my wall like a vampire sucking me dry. Imagine stepping out to grab a lawn rake and discovering your storage space transformed into a personal fueling station for a neighbor you barely tolerate. That was my Thursday. And yes, I laughed first, because the absurdity of it all hit harder than the rage. I laughed because my shed doesn't even lock properly, because I'd been nagging myself for months to fix the hinges, and because of course the one person who would exploit that weakness was Karen, our neighborhood's self-appointed HOA queen and lifelong thorn in everyone's side. Karen's Tesla sat humming there like it owned the place. The orange extension cord wasn't even subtle. She dragged it across the fence, through her hydrangeas, and into my shed where she jammed it into a power strip I use for my tools. My breaker box was groaning under the load, the meter spinning like a carnival ride. It didn't take a genius to know that this wasn't her first time. Judging by the cord marks in the dirt and the way the car was parked halfway up my lawn, she'd been doing this quietly at night for weeks, counting on my obliviousness. Now let me explain something about Karen. She doesn't think of herself as entitled. In her head, she's efficient, resourceful, maybe even neighborly. She'll borrow without asking, dictate HOA rules no one voted on, and file complaints against you for the smallest infractions, all while believing she's the hero of the block. That's what makes her dangerous. It isn't cartoon villainy. It's delusion wrapped in suburban politeness. So of course, in her mind, using my shed as a charging station wasn't theft, it was just community sharing. When I confronted her that afternoon, she didn't even blink. She was clipping her roses, wearing oversized sunglasses and that smug little smile she reserves for moments when she thinks she's untouchable. I pointed at the cord stretched across our property line. "Care to explain why your Tesla is drinking from my shed?" I asked. She cocked her head, barely pausing the clippers. "Oh, that. You weren't using it anyway. Besides, it's safer on your circuit than mine. My electrician said so." I nearly choked. "Safer? For whom?" "Karen," I said, "you're stealing my electricity." She waved her hand as if swatting away a gnat. "Stealing? Don't be dramatic. It's a couple of kilowatts. You should be glad I'm not suing you for tripping my breaker last week." That's when I realized this wasn't going to be a simple confrontation. She'd already reframed the narrative in her head. In Karen's version of the story, I wasn't the victim. I was the negligent neighbor with a shed that existed to serve her needs. I decided not to escalate right then. She thrived on drama, and if I exploded, she'd twist it into an HOA complaint faster than her Tesla could drain a battery. So I just nodded, unplugged the cord, and walked away, letting her think she'd won. What she didn't know was that I had no intention of running to the HOA or filing a petty police report. No, I was going to fix this myself, in a way she would never forget. The first step was research. I spent that night reading everything I could about Tesla charging, power draw, and how to rewire outlet. The more I read, the more amused I became. Tesla batteries are hungry beasts. Leave them connected to a reversed or modified outlet, and instead of filling up, they trickle down. By dawn, I had a plan so deviously simple it made me grin. I'd let her keep stealing power from my shed, except I'd flip the script. Every night she plugged in, her car would wake up emptier than before. The setup wasn't hard. I reconfigured the breaker on that circuit with a little help from a buddy who's an electrician. Officially, he told me not to mess with it, but unofficially, he laughed so hard at the idea that he accidentally gave me tip. I installed a hidden bypass, one that would drain current instead of feed it. Then I rerouted the output through a dummy outlet that looked perfectly normal. To Karen, nothing had changed. She'd still sneak her car in at night, still see the charger light flicker green. But instead of her battery charging to 80%, it would be bleeding out mile by mile. The first night I sat by my window with a beer, watching the orange cord snake back into my shed like a thief's calling card. I pictured her smug satisfaction as she went to bed, assuming she'd outsmarted me again. By morning, her car would be sitting there like a dead phone at 2%, and she'd have no clue why. The beauty of it was that she couldn't complain without admitting the theft. She'd be trapped in her own arrogance, and I'd finally get some peace. But Karen doesn't go down quietly. She never has. And as I learned the next morning, the fallout was going to be bigger, louder, and far more ridiculous than anything I could have imagined. Because Karen didn't just wake up to a drained Tesla, she woke up late for an HOA board meeting, stormed outside, and discovered her pride and joy electric chariot flatlined in my yard, still tethered to my shed like evidence of her crime. The look on her face was worth every ounce of preparation. But it was only the beginning, because when she yanked the cord free and tried to start the car, the entire neighborhood heard her scream. And by noon, rumors were already flying that my shed had somehow sabotaged her property. The neighborhood grapevine works faster than any internet forum. By mid-morning, I was already the villain in 3 different versions of Karen's story. According to the whispers floating through driveways and porch chats, I had rigged my shed to attack her Tesla. One neighbor swore I'd installed some illegal power regulator that fried her battery. Another claimed Karen saw sparks flying from my outlet and barely saved her car from exploding. The most absurd rumor, no doubt Karen's favorite, was that I was jealous of her green lifestyle and had sabotaged her out of spite. The funny part? Nobody questioned why her car had been plugged into my shed in the first place. Karen had twisted the narrative so completely that the theft wasn't even mentioned. She'd turned herself into the victim before anyone asked a single hard question. Still, I didn't rush to defend myself. Experience had taught me that trying to untangle Karen's lies only made me look defensive. Instead, I decided to sit back, let her dig her own hole, and watch where she stumbled. And stumble she did, spectacularly, the very next evening. Around 9 o'clock, I caught her creeping across my lawn again. I was on my porch pretending to water the plants, but really, I was waiting. The orange cord trailed behind her like a leash, and she moved fast, glancing around as though she were breaking into Fort Knox instead of an unlocked shed. She plugged in the Tesla, gave it a little pat on the hood, and strutted away with the satisfaction of someone who thought she'd won. I nearly applauded. Because of course she hadn't fixed her car. She'd just assumed the previous night's disaster was a fluke. The arrogance was staggering, but also perfect. She was about to give me another free show. By morning, it happened again. The Tesla was dead, battery drained to zero, parked like a useless monument in my backyard. This time, though, she didn't scream. She marched straight to my front door and rang the bell with the kind of fury that rattled the frame. I opened it slowly, coffee mug in hand, wearing my most innocent expression. "Morning, Karen." "Coffee?" She didn't even answer, just barged past me like she owned the place. "You need to explain what you did to my car," she hissed. "Your shed is destroying it." I took a sip of coffee. "Karen, my shed doesn't charge cars. You're imagining things." Her sunglasses were perched on her head now, and I could see the frantic gleam in her eyes. She wasn't used to hitting a wall she couldn't control. "I could sue you," she snapped. "I could call the HOA right now. This is property damage." I raised my eyebrows. "So, you're admitting you've been plugging into my property without permission? Bold strategy." She froze. For the first time, she realized she'd said too much. I watched the wheels in her head turn as she backpedaled. "No, I mean, it wasn't without permission. It's a community shed, isn't it? Everyone uses it." The lie was so brazen I almost admired it. "Community shed?" I repeated, laughing. "Karen, it's literally in my backyard. With my tools. What community is that, me and you?" She didn't answer. She just stormed out, slamming my door behind her. But her silence told me something important. She wasn't going to the police. She wasn't going to risk putting her theft on record. That meant she was cornered. And when Karen is cornered, she gets creative. 2 days later, I learned what creative meant. I was working in my garage when I noticed a city utility truck parked suspiciously close to my property line. 2 men in hard hats were inspecting the power meter on my house. I walked over casually. "Morning, gentlemen. Everything all right?" One of them, clipboard in hand, looked up. "We got a report of irregular draw from this address. Someone called in saying you might be illegally tapping into the grid." I nearly laughed out loud. Karen had escalated to the nuclear option, turning the tables and accusing me of the exact crime she'd committed. I played dumb, of course. "Illegal tapping? Not here. My usage is normal. Want to see the bills?" They shrugged, did their checks, and left without incident. But the damage was done. Karen had officially tried to weaponize the city against me. The gloves were off. That night, I decided to up the stakes. Until now, I'd just been inconveniencing her, draining her battery, letting her stew in confusion. But Karen had shown she was willing to drag outsiders into this fight. If she was going to escalate, then so would I. So I set a trap. I repositioned a motion-activated trail camera inside the shed, hidden behind a box of paint cans. Nothing fancy, just enough to catch a clear shot of her plugging in the car. Then I laid out the bait. I restored the shed's normal wiring, just for one night, so the Tesla would actually charge. Sure enough, at midnight, Karen crept across my yard again. The camera snapped a dozen crisp photos of her trespassing, plugging in, and stealing my power. She had no idea I was watching from my upstairs window, sipping a beer like it was a movie premiere. By morning, I had the evidence neatly downloaded and ready. The Tesla sat charged and smug in her driveway, while I held the digital equivalent of a smoking gun. And here's the delicious part. I didn't show her the pictures. Not yet. Instead, I printed one copy and slipped it anonymously into the HOA president's mailbox. The fallout was immediate. The next day, Karen showed up at the community meeting looking rattled, while the president cleared his throat and announced, "We've received some troubling information about unauthorized use of private property." The room buzzed with speculation. Karen sat stiff as a board, pretending not to know anything. But her reputation had cracked, and everyone could sense it. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to slink away in shame. She'd double down, triple down, do anything to claw back her image of control. And true to form, she arrived at my house that evening with a brand new tactic. This time, she wasn't screaming. She was smiling. "Listen," she said sweetly, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. Maybe we could work out a deal? I use your shed at night, and in exchange, I'll waive your HOA dues for the year." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Waive my dues? You don't even have that power." She shrugged. "I have influence." It was absurd. She'd gone from theft to blackmail to bribery in under a week, like a criminal speedrunning every bad decision possible. And as I stood there, trying not to laugh in her face, I realized something. Karen wasn't going to stop. Not until she was publicly, undeniably humiliated. Not until the entire neighborhood saw her for what she really was. That was when the idea hit me. If she wanted to play power games, I'd give her a stage big enough to collapse her whole act. The plan that formed in my head was risky, maybe even reckless, but it would end the war once and for all. I'd let her take the bait one final time, then I'd make sure the entire neighborhood was watching when the curtain fell. Karen's downfall needed to be spectacular. Not a quiet scolding, not a whispered warning from the HOA president. It had to be something public, undeniable, and impossible for her to spin. That was the only way to end this cycle. Because if there's one thing I'd learned, it's that Karen's greatest weapon wasn't her arrogance or her lies. It was her ability to twist reality until people doubted what they saw with their own eyes. So I decided to build her a reality she couldn't escape. The perfect stage presented itself in the form of the upcoming neighborhood Green Living Fair. Every spring, the HOA held this self-congratulatory event to pat themselves on the back for recycling and composting. There were booths about solar panels, rainwater collection, and whatever new eco-gadget the vendors wanted to sell. And, naturally, Karen was on the organizing committee. She'd already bragged to anyone who'd listen that her Tesla would be the centerpiece of the fair, a shining symbol of her eco-conscious superiority. That's when the plan crystallized. If she wanted her car to be the star attraction, then I'd make sure it got the spotlight. Not as a symbol of sustainability, but as proof of her theft. I had photos. I had video. What I needed was timing, and just enough rope for her to hang herself with. The week before the fair, I played it cool. I let her think I'd softened. When she came around again, all smiles and faux sweetness, I pretended to consider her deal. I even let her plug into the shed once more, this time without draining her battery. She left smug and satisfied, convinced she'd worn me down. The more comfortable she got, the harder she'd fall. Meanwhile, I set up the stage. I bought a small portable projector and a collapsible screen under the guise of demonstrating solar panel efficiency. No one batted an eye. After all, the fair was full of show-and-tell booths. I cleared it with the committee chair, who, conveniently, was not Karen, and got a prime spot near the refreshment table where everyone would gather. The screen would face the crowd, and the camera footage would do the rest. The night before the fair, I caught her again. Midnight, same routine, Tesla nosing into my shed, cord dragging across the grass, her flashlight beam bouncing off my walls. My camera caught every detail, every angle, as she plugged in without hesitation. This was the footage I'd been waiting for. I didn't just want still photos. I wanted a moving picture, undeniable proof of her trespassing and theft. When she drove off the next morning, humming happily down the street, she had no idea she'd just starred in her own downfall. The day of the fair dawned bright and sunny, the kind of weather that makes everyone feel chipper and sociable. Tents went up, kids ran around with compostable balloons, and neighbors milled about sipping organic lemonade. Karen, of course, floated through the crowd like royalty, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and telling anyone who'd listen that her Tesla would be on display in half an hour. She was in her element, preening, boasting, reveling in attention. She had no idea I was just a few booths away, quietly setting up my projector and waiting. When the time came, Karen stood beside her car like a queen presenting a crown jewel. She launched into a speech about sustainability, about how forward-thinking homeowners, like her, were leading the charge toward a greener future. I had to hand it to her. She had charisma when she wanted it. People nodded, clapped politely, and admired the gleaming white Tesla. She basked in it. Then, with perfect timing, I raised my hand. "Excuse me," I called out, projecting my voice. "If we're celebrating green living, shouldn't we also talk about accountability? About how we power our vehicles?" Heads turned. Karen's smile faltered for half a second, but she quickly recovered. "Of course," she said smoothly. "That's why I'm proud to charge my car responsibly at home." That was my cue. I tapped the projector remote. The screen lit up. And there it was. Grainy but unmistakable footage of Karen creeping across my yard at midnight, cord in hand, plugging her Tesla into my shed. The crowd gasped. The video looped, showing her movements over and over. Sneaking, plugging, stealing. There was no mistaking her face, her posture, her arrogance. Karen froze. For a split second, she looked like a deer in headlights, every ounce of her composure cracking. Then, true to form, she tried to spin. This is doctored. He's framing me. That's not even my cord." The problem was, it was her cord. Bright orange, with her initials taped on the plug in faded Sharpie. The same cord she'd bragged about buying at Home Depot last summer. The crowd saw it too. Murmurs rippled through the fair, neighbors whispering, eyebrows raised, glances exchanged. I didn't say a word. I just let the footage play, arms folded, while the weight of her own actions crushed her. Finally, the HOA president cleared his throat. "Karen, is this true?" His tone was more weary than angry, as though he'd expected this all along. She sputtered, waved her hands, tried to pivot into a rant about community resources and shared responsibility. But the damage was done. The murmurs grew louder, laughter bubbled up from the back, and someone actually booed. Karen snapped. She screamed something about conspiracies, about neighbors turning against her, about how none of us understood the sacrifices she made for the community. Then she stormed off, sun hat askew, leaving her Tesla sitting there like an abandoned prop. It was chaos and it was glorious. But here's where things got really interesting. The fair should have ended there, with Karen humiliated, exposed, and retreating in shame. Instead, something else happened. People started asking questions. Not about me or my shed, but about the HOA itself. If Karen had been abusing her position, what else had she been hiding? Were the arbitrary fines she'd issued over the past year legitimate? Were the mandatory landscaping fees real, or just her invention? By the end of the day, the fair had turned into an impromptu HOA inquisition. The president, flustered, promised a full review of policies. Neighbors exchanged stories. Unfair citations, bogus rules, threats of fines that never materialized. For the first time in years, Karen's grip on the neighborhood was visibly slipping. The queen had been dethroned, and the subjects were revolting. I should have been satisfied. After all, I'd accomplished what I set out to do. Karen was exposed, humiliated, and stripped of credibility. But as I watched her retreating figure vanish down the street, I felt a pang of unease. Because people like Karen don't just disappear. They don't admit defeat and quietly fade away. No, Karen would be back. And she wouldn't come with cords or sun hats next time. She'd come armed with something bigger, nastier, and more dangerous. That night, as I packed away the projector, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. I answered, and froze at the sound of Karen's voice on the other end. Calm, measured, almost sweet. "You think you embarrassed me today," she said softly. "But you don't understand. You've made this personal now. And when things get personal, I don't stop. I don't forgive. And I don't forget." The line went dead. When Karen threatened me over the phone, I didn't take it lightly. Her tone wasn't the usual shrill indignation or faux authority voice she used at HOA meetings. No, this was something colder, more deliberate, the kind of calm that tells you someone has already started plotting. I knew then that the humiliation at the Green Living Fair had cracked her ego in a way she couldn't repair, and now she wanted revenge. What I didn't know was how far she'd go, or how quickly. The first sign came 2 days later. I woke up to find a bright yellow notice taped to my front door. Violation, unauthorized outbuilding. According to the notice, my shed was in violation of HOA guidelines and had to be removed within 30 days or face daily fines. I almost laughed. My shed had been there for 15 years, long before Karen even moved into the neighborhood. Everyone knew it was grandfathered into the property. But Karen had clearly twisted some obscure rule and filed the complaint herself. The notice even had her signature at the bottom, written in that tight, self-important scrawl she used on every HOA memo. I crumpled the paper and tossed it inside, but I knew the fight wasn't about the shed. It was about power. She couldn't erase the video footage of her theft, so she was going after the symbol of it, the shed itself. If she could get rid of it, she could claim victory, rewrite history, and frame me as the real problem. I wasn't about to let that happen. Instead of rushing to the HOA board, I went to my neighbor, Dave. Dave's the kind of guy who knows everyone, the unofficial mayor of the cul-de-sac. More importantly, he's got a filing cabinet full of old HOA documents dating back to when the neighborhood was built. Over beers in his garage, I explained the situation. He shook his head, grinning. "She really doesn't quit, does she?" He pulled out a dusty binder, flipped a few pages, and jabbed his finger at a clause. "Right here. Structures built prior to 2008 are exempt from new building code. Your shed's untouchable." He made a photocopy for me and handed it over. If she pushes this, you've got her cornered. I felt better armed, but Karen wasn't slowing down. The next tactic hit a few days later: noise complaints. Every time I so much as ran my lawnmower or used my drill, I got another official-looking slip in the mail. Karen claimed I was disturbing the peace at all hours. The best part? One of the complaints was time-stamped for 3 a.m., when I was dead asleep. She was fabricating evidence now, hoping to bury me under paperwork and fines until I broke. But I wasn't breaking. I was documenting. Every slip, every bogus claim, every ridiculous accusation. I saved them all, photographing and time-stamping them. I wanted a full record, because I had a feeling this was going to escalate into something bigger. And I was right. A week later, I came home from work to find a city inspector's car parked in front of my house. Clipboard in hand, the inspector walked around my property, peering at the shed, snapping photos of my siding, even checking my gutter drains. I introduced myself, asked what was going on. He sighed. We got multiple complaints filed against this address. Unsafe wiring, illegal modifications, structural hazards. We're required to investigate. I knew exactly who filed them. Karen had gone over the HOA's head and dragged city authorities into the mix. I played it cool, showed him around, let him check the breaker box and the outlet. By the end of the inspection, he shook his head. Everything looks fine. Sorry for the hassle. Somebody out here clearly has too much time on their hands. He left, and I stood in the driveway, watching him go, knowing Karen was probably peeking through her blinds, seething that her plan had failed. That night, I decided enough was enough. She wasn't just annoying anymore. She was harassing me, weaponizing bureaucracy, and wasting city resources. I needed a counterstrike, something that would not only shut her down but also show the neighborhood exactly who she was. And then it hit me. If Karen wanted to play the legal game, I'd beat her at it. I called a lawyer. My cousin recommended a local attorney named Rachel, sharp as a scalpel and twice as precise. I brought her the binder of documents, the stack of fake complaints, and the video footage of Karen stealing electricity. Rachel flipped through everything with a kind of calm efficiency that made me feel like I'd just loaded a gun and handed it to her. "This is harassment," she said matter-of-factly. "Documented, repeated, intentional. We can file for a restraining order. At the very least, we'll scare her into backing off." The idea of serving Karen legal papers made me giddy. But Rachel advised patience. "Timing is everything," she explained. "If we file now, she'll twist it into a narrative about you being petty or vindictive. But if she escalates just a little more, we'll have an airtight case." So I waited. And sure enough, Karen delivered. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of footsteps in my yard. I peeked out the window and nearly laughed out loud. There she was, in her robe and slippers, flashlight in hand, sneaking around my shed again. Except this time, she wasn't plugging in her car. She was unscrewing the hinges on the door. My shed door. At 3 in the morning. I grabbed my phone, hit record, and filmed her fumbling with the screws, muttering to herself. After a few minutes, she gave up and stomped back across the lawn, tripping over the cord she'd abandoned weeks earlier. The next morning, I handed the footage straight to Rachel. Her eyes lit up. Perfect. Trespassing, attempted property damage, harassment. This isn't just a restraining order anymore, we can sue for damages. Within 48 hours, Karen was served with legal papers. The look on her face as the process server handed her the envelope was priceless. She sputtered, turned red, shouted about conspiracies and neighborhood betrayal, but there was no spinning this. The law was involved now. And when word spread through the neighborhood, her reputation, which had already been cracked, began to crumble completely. But Karen wasn't done. Even with legal action looming over her, she doubled down. At the next HOA meeting, she stood up in front of everyone and launched into a tirade about how I was endangering the community with my shed. She waved copies of her bogus complaints, ranted about phantom fire hazards, and even claimed I was secretly running an illegal business out of my garage. The more she spoke, the more unhinged she sounded. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances. Finally, Dave stood up and cut her off. "Karen, enough. We've seen the evidence. We know what you've been doing. This isn't leadership, it's harassment." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. For the first time, Karen wasn't just being questioned, she was being challenged, openly, by the very people she'd lorded over for years. She tried to fight back, but the tide had turned. The president of the HOA cleared his throat and announced that, effective immediately, Karen was suspended from her role pending a full review. The look on her face was a mix of rage and disbelief, like a queen watching her crown melt. She stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door so hard the blinds rattled. When I saw the breaker box, wires crossed and circuits humming dangerously, a knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't petty anymore. This wasn't HOA notices or late-night trespassing. This was sabotage, reckless, criminal, and potentially lethal. Karen had crossed a line so sharp it sliced through any doubt I'd ever had about her intentions. She wasn't trying to win anymore. She was trying to destroy me. I shut the breaker off and sat in the dark for a few minutes, steadying my breath. The air smelled faintly metallic, like ozone after a lightning strike. If I hadn't caught it in time, the wiring could have sparked a fire while I slept. My home, my shed, everything I owned, it all could have gone up in flames. That thought jolted me into motion. I grabbed my phone, dialed Rachel, and told her what I'd found. Her voice was low, measured, but firm. "You need to call the police. Now. This isn't civil anymore, it's criminal." I hesitated. Calling the cops felt like letting Karen win, like admitting she'd gotten under my skin. But this wasn't about ego. It was about safety. So I called. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, flashlights sweeping my yard as I showed them the tampered breaker box. They didn't laugh it off. They took photos, filed a report, and promised to follow up. One of them, a veteran with weary eyes, shook his head. "If you've got enemies, they're dangerous ones. Be careful." Word spread fast. By the next morning, half the neighborhood knew Karen had been reported to the police. She, of course, denied everything. She marched from door to door, telling anyone who'd listen that I was framing her, that I'd rigged my own breaker just to make her look bad. But for once, nobody seemed to believe her. Too much had piled up, the videos, the complaints, the legal papers. The foundation of trust she'd built her power on was gone, and she couldn't patch it back together. That didn't stop her from trying one last desperate play. A week later, the HOA called an emergency meeting. The flyer slipped under my door claimed it was to address community safety concerns. I knew immediately it was Karen's doing. She was cornered, humiliated, facing legal consequences, and when Karen was cornered, she went for the loudest stage she could find. The meeting was packed. Neighbors crowded into the clubhouse, buzzing with anticipation. Karen stood at the front, clutching a thick folder of papers, her hair perfectly coiffed, her expression tight with restrained fury. When the room quieted, she launched into her performance. "This community is under threat," she declared, her voice trembling with conviction. "Not from crime, not from outsiders, but from one of our own. This man," she pointed straight at me, "has endangered us all. His shed is a hazard. His wiring is illegal. He has harassed me, framed me, and tried to destroy my reputation." She flipped open her folder, waving the bogus complaints like holy scripture. "I demand that the HOA take immediate action to remove this danger before something catastrophic happens." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but it wasn't the supportive agreement she wanted. It was skepticism, weariness, even laughter. People had seen too much. I waited until she paused for breath, then stood slowly, holding up a USB drive. "Funny thing about evidence," I said, keeping my voice calm, steady. "It tells the story whether you like it or not." I walked to the projector at the back of the room and plugged in the drive. The screen lit up with the footage I'd been saving, The clearest angle yet of Karen sneaking into my yard, fumbling with the breaker box, crossing wires with a screwdriver clutched in her hand. Gasps filled the room. Karen's face drained of color. She lunged forward, shouting, "That's fake! He edited it! He's obsessed with me!" But the video kept rolling, showing her muttering under her breath, sweating under the beam of her own flashlight. The timestamp was unmistakable. The screwdriver was unmistakable. And the sabotage was unmistakable. The HOA president stood, his voice sharp. "Karen, that's enough. You're suspended indefinitely. And after this, I think we'll be reviewing whether you belong on this board, or in this community, at all." The room erupted, some neighbors cheering, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Karen's folder slipped from her hands, papers scattering across the floor. For the first time, she looked small, diminished, no longer the untouchable queen of the cul-de-sac, but just a neighbor caught red-handed in her own madness. She stormed out, face red, eyes wild, slamming the clubhouse door behind her. But the story didn't end there. The police investigation moved fast once I handed over the footage. Combined with the tampered breaker box and Rachel's documentation of harassment, it was more than enough. Within days, Karen was formally charged with trespassing, vandalism, and reckless endangerment. Watching a patrol car pull up to her driveway and lead her out in handcuffs was surreal. Neighbors gathered at their windows, some whispering, some openly grinning. 4 years, she'd ruled with threats, fines, and intimidation. Now she was just another mugshot in the system. After she was gone, the neighborhood shifted. Meetings were calmer. Rules were enforced fairly. People stopped whispering and started talking openly again. It felt like a weight had lifted from the block. My shed stood untouched, sturdy as ever, a symbol of both Karen's obsession and her undoing. And me? I didn't gloat. Not outwardly, anyway. I fixed the wiring properly, double-checked every outlet, and even installed a new lock on the shed. But sometimes, late at night, I'd stand by the window with a beer in hand, staring at the patch of lawn where her Tesla used to sit. I'd remember the smug smile, the orange cord, the arrogance that convinced her she was untouchable. And I'd smile to myself, because in the end, she wasn't undone by me or by the HOA or even by the law. She was undone by her own entitlement, her own refusal to recognize that boundaries existed. The neighborhood never saw her again. Rumor had it she sold her house in a fire sale, moving to another subdivision miles away. Maybe she's already found a new shed to invade, a new neighbor to torment. Maybe she's telling herself the same story she always did, that she was the victim, the misunderstood heroine of her own suburban drama. But I know the truth, and so does everyone else who watched the video, who saw her dragged away in cuffs, who lived under her reign and finally breathed free when it ended. The truth is simple. You can steal power from a shed, you can twist rules and bully neighbors, but sooner or later, you run out of people to fool. And when that happens, all that's left is the silence of an empty driveway where your shiny Tesla used to sit, and the memory of a neighborhood that finally said, "Enough." That silence, I realized, was the sweetest sound I'd heard in years.